Welcome to Long Stories for Sleep. Just set me playing, relax, and drift off. Subscribe and you'll have a library of stories to choose from. Comment to let me know where in the world you are and what stories you would like added. That's really helpful information. Enough rambling. On with the story.
The Life of Horatio, Lord Nelson by Robert Southey. Part 4. 1796 to 1797. Read for you by Long Stories for Sleep. Chapter 4. 1796 to 1797. Sir J. Jarvis takes the command. Genoa joins the French. Bonaparte begins his career. Evacuation of Corsica. Nelson hoists his broad pennant in the min of action with the Sabina battle off Cape St. Vincent. Nelson commands the inner squadron at the blockade of Coddy's boat. Action in the Bay of Coddy's expedition against Tenerife. Nelson loses an arm. His sufferings in England, and recovery. Sir John Jarvis had now arrived to take the command of the Mediterranean fleet. The Agamemnon having, as her captain said, been made as fit for sea as a rotten ship could be, Nelson sailed from Leghorn, and joined the Admiral in Fiorenzo Bay. "I found him," said he, "anxious to know many things which I was a good deal surprised to find had not been communicated to him by others in the fleet, and it would appear that he was so well satisfied with my opinion of what is likely to happen, and the means of prevention to be taken, that he had no reserve with me respecting his information and ideas of what is likely to be done." The manner in which Nelson was received is said to have excited some envy. One captain observed to him, "You did just as you pleased in Lord Hood's time, the same in Admiral Hotham's, and now again with Sir John Jarvis. It makes no difference to you who is Commander-in-Chief." A higher compliment could not have been paid to any Commander-in-Chief than to say of him that he understood the merits of Nelson, and left him, as far as possible, to act upon his own judgment. Sir John Jarvis offered him the St. George, 90, or the Zealous, 74, and asked if he should have any objection to serve under him with his flag. He replied, that if the Agamemnon were ordered home and his flag were not arrived, he should, on many accounts, wish to return to England. Still, if the war continued, he should be very proud of hoisting his flag under Sir John's command. "We cannot spare you," said Sir John, "either as captain or admiral." Accordingly, he resumed his station in the Gulf of Genoa. The French had not followed up their successes in that quarter with their usual celerity. Scherer, who commanded there, owed his advancement to any other cause than his merit. He was a favorite of the Directory, but for the present, through the influence of Berras, he was removed from a command for which his incapacity was afterwards clearly proved, and Bonaparte was appointed to succeed him. Bonaparte had given indications of his military talents at Toulon, and of his remorseless nature at Paris, but the extent either of his ability or his wickedness was at this time known to none, and perhaps not even suspected by himself. Nelson supposed, from the information which he had obtained, that one column of the French army would take possession of Port Especia, either penetrating through the Genoese territory, or proceeding coastways in light vessels, our ships of war not being able to approach the coast, because of the shallowness of the water. To prevent this, he said, two things were necessary, the possession of Vado Bay, and the taking of Port Especia. If either of these points were secured, Italy would be safe from any attack of the French by sea. General Beaulieu, who had now superseded de Vinnes in the command of the allied Austrian and Sardinian army, sent his nephew and aide-de-camp to communicate with Nelson, and inquire whether he could anchor in any other place than Vado Bay. Nelson replied, that Vado was the only place where the British fleet could lie in safety, but all places would suit his squadron, and wherever the general came to the seacoast, there he should find it. The Austrian repeatedly asked, if there was not a risk of losing the squadron, and was constantly answered, that if these ships should be lost, the admiral would find others. But all plans of cooperation with the Austrians were soon frustrated by the Battle of Montinot. Beaulieu ordered an attack to be made upon the post of Voltri. It was made 12 hours before the time which he had fixed, and before he arrived to direct it. In consequence, the French were enabled to effect their retreat, and fall back to Montinot, thus giving the troops there a decisive superiority in number over the division which attacked them. This drew on the defeat of the Austrians. Bonaparte, with a celerity which had never before been witnessed in modern war, pursued his advantages, and, in the course of a fortnight, dictated to the court of Turin terms of peace, or rather of submission, by which all the strongest places of Piedmont were put into his bands. On one occasion, and only on one, Nelson was able to impede the progress of this new conqueror. 6 vessels, laden with cannon and ordnance stores for the siege of Mantua, sailed from Toulon for St. Pierre d'Arena. Assisted by Captain Cockburn, in the Maliga, he drove them under a battery, pursued them, silenced the batteries, and captured the whole. Military books, plans and maps of Italy, with the different points marked upon them where former battles had been fought, sent by the Directory for Bonaparte's use, were found in the convoy. The loss of this artillery was one of the chief causes which compelled the French to raise the siege of Mantua, but there was too much treachery, and too much imbecility, both in the councils and armies of the Allied powers, for Austria to improve this momentary success. Bonaparte perceived that the conquest of Italy was within his reach. Treaties, and the rights of neutral or of friendly powers, were as little regarded by him as by the government for which he acted. In open contempt of both he entered Tuscany, and took possession of Leghorn. In consequence of this movement, Nelson blockaded that port, and landed a British force in the Isle of Elba, to secure Porto Ferrajo. Soon afterwards he took the island of Capraja, which had formerly belonged to Corsica, being less than 40 miles distant from it, a distance, however, short as it was, which enabled the Genoese to retain it, after their infamous sale of Corsica to France. Genoa had now taken part with France, its government had long covertly assisted the French, and now willingly yielded to the first compulsory menace which required them to exclude the English from their ports. Capraja was seized in consequence, but this act of vigor was not followed up as it ought to have been. England at that time depended too much upon the feeble governments of the continent, and too little upon itself. It was determined by the British cabinet to evacuate Corsica, as soon as Spain should form an offensive alliance with France. This event, which, from the moment that Spain had been compelled to make peace, was clearly foreseen, had now taken place, and orders for the evacuation of the island were immediately sent out. It was impolitic to annex this island to the British dominions, but having done so, it was disgraceful thus to abandon it. The disgrace would have been spared, and every advantage which could have been derived from the possession of the island secured, if the people had at first been left to form a government for themselves, and protected by us in the enjoyment of their independence. The Viceroy, Sir Gilbert Elliot, deeply felt the impolicy and ignominy of this evacuation. The fleet also was ordered to leave the Mediterranean. This resolution was so contrary to the last instructions which had been received, that Nelson exclaimed, "Do His Majesty's ministers know their own minds? They at home," said he, "do not know what this fleet is capable of performing anything and everything. Much as I shall rejoice to see England, I lament our present orders in sackcloth and ashes, so dishonourable to the dignity of England, whose fleets are equal to meet the world in arms, and of all the fleets I ever saw, I never beheld one, in point of officers and men, equal to Sir John Jervis's, who is a commander-in-chief able to lead them to glory." Sir Gilbert Elliot believed that the great body of the Corsicans were perfectly satisfied, as they had good reason to be, with the British government, sensible of its advantages, and attached to it. However this may have been, when they found that the English intended to evacuate the island, they naturally and necessarily sent to make their peace with the French. The partisans of France found none to oppose them. A committee of 30 took upon them the government of Bastia, and sequestrated all the British property. Armed Corsicans mounted guard at every place, and a plan was laid for seizing the Viceroy. Nelson, who was appointed to superintend the evacuation, frustrated these projects. At a time when everyone else despaired of saving stores, cannon, provisions, or property of any kind, and a privateer was moored across the Mole Head to prevent all boats from passing, he sent word to the committee, that if the slightest opposition were made to the embarkment and removal of British property, he would batter the town down. The privateer pointed her guns at the officer who carried this message, and muskets were levelled against his boats from the Mole Head. Upon this Captain Sutton, of the Egmont, pulling out his watch, gave them a quarter of an hour to deliberate upon their answer. In 5 minutes after the expiration of that time, the ships, he said, would open their fire. Upon this the very sentinels scampered off, and every vessel came out of the mole. A shipowner complained to the Commodore that the municipality refused to let him take his goods out of the custom house. Nelson directed him to say that unless they were instantly delivered, he would open his fire. The committee turned pale, and, without answering a word, gave him the keys. Their last attempt was to levy a duty upon the things that were re-embarked. He sent them word that he would pay them a disagreeable visit if there were any more complaints. The committee then, finding that they had to deal with a man who knew his own power and was determined to make the British name respected, desisted from the insolent conduct which they had assumed, and it was acknowledged that Bastia never had been so quiet and orderly since the English were in possession of it. This was on the 14th of October. During the 5 following days the work of embarkation was carried on, the private property was saved, and public stores to the amount of L200,000. The French, favoured by the Spanish fleet, which was at that time within 12 leagues of Bastia, pushed over troops from Leghorn, who landed near Cape Corse on the 18th, and on the 20th, at 1 in the morning, entered the citadel, an hour only after the British had spiked the guns and evacuated it. Nelson embarked at daybreak, being the last person who left the shore, having thus, as he said, seen the first and the last of Corsica. Provoked at the conduct of the municipality, and the disposition which the populace had shown to profit by the confusion, he turned towards the shore, as he stepped into his boat, and exclaimed, "Now, John Corse, follow the natural bent of your detestable character, plunder and revenge." This, however, was not Nelson's deliberate opinion of the people of Corsica. He knew that their vices were the natural consequences of internal anarchy and foreign oppression, such as the same causes would produce in any people, and when he saw that of all those who took leave of the Viceroy there was not one who parted from him without tears, he acknowledged that they manifestly acted not from dislike of the English, but from fear of the French. England then might, with more reason, reproach her own rulers for pusillanimity than the Corsicans for ingratitude. Having thus ably effected this humiliating service, Nelson was ordered to hoist his broad pendant on board the Minerve frigate, Captain George Cockburn, and with the Blanche under his command, proceed to Porto Ferrajo, and superintend the evacuation of that place also. On his way, he fell in with 2 Spanish frigates, the Sabina and the Ceres. The Minerve engaged the former, which was commanded by D. Jacobo Stewart, a descendant of the Duke of Berwick. After an action of 3 hours, during which the Spaniards lost 164 men, the Sabina struck. The Spanish captain, who was the only surviving officer, had hardly been conveyed on board the Minerve, when another enemy's frigate came up, compelled her to cast off the prize, and brought her a second time into action. After half an hour's trial of strength, this new antagonist wore and hauled off, but a Spanish squadron of 2 ships of the line and 2 frigates came in sight. The Blanche, from which the Ceres had got off, was far to windward, and the Minerve escaped only by the anxiety of the enemy to recover their own ship. As soon as Nelson reached Porto Ferrajo he sent his prisoner in a flag of truce to Carthagena, having returned him his sword. This he did in honour of the gallantry which D. Jacobo had displayed, and not without some feeling of respect for his ancestry. "I felt it," said he, "consonant to the dignity of my country, and I always act as I feel right, without regard to custom." He was reputed the best officer in Spain, and his men were worthy of such a commander. By the same flag of truce he sent back all the Spanish prisoners at Porto Ferrajo, in exchange for whom he received his own men who had been taken in the prize. General de Burgh, who commanded at the Isle of Elba, did not think himself authorized to abandon the place till he had received specific instructions from England to that effect, professing that he was unable to decide between the contradictory orders of government, or to guess at what their present intentions might be. But he said, his only motive for urging delay in this measure arose from a desire that his own conduct might be properly sanctioned, not from any opinion that Porto Ferrajo ought to be retained. But Naples having made peace, Sir John Jervis considered his business with Italy as concluded, and the protection of Portugal was the point to which he was now instructed to attend. Nelson, therefore, whose orders were perfectly clear and explicit, withdrew the whole naval establishment from that station, leaving the transports victualled, and so arranged that all the troops and stores could be embarked in 3 days. He was now about to leave the Mediterranean. Mr. Drake, who had been our minister at Genoa, expressed to him, on this occasion, the very high opinion which the Allies entertained of his conspicuous merit, adding, that it was impossible for any one, who had the honor of cooperating with him, not to admire the activity, talents, and zeal which he had so eminently and constantly displayed. In fact, during this long course of services in the Mediterranean, the whole of his conduct had exhibited the same zeal, the same indefatigable energy, the same intuitive judgment, the same prompt and unerring decision which characterized his after career of glory. His name was as yet hardly known to the English public, but it was feared and respected throughout Italy. A letter came to him, directed Horatio Nelson, Genoa, and the writer, when he was asked how he could direct it so vaguely, replied, "Sir, there is but one Horatio Nelson in the world." At Genoa, in particular, where he had so long been stationed, and where the nature of his duty first led him to continual disputes with the government, and afterwards compelled him to stop the trade of the port, he was equally respected by the Doge and by the people, for, while he maintained the rights and interests of Great Britain with becoming firmness, he tempered the exercise of power with courtesy and humanity wherever duty would permit. "Had all my actions," said he, writing at this time to his wife, "been gazetted, not one fortnight would have passed, during the whole war, without a letter from me. One day or other I will have a long gazette to myself. I feel that such an opportunity will be given me. I cannot, if I am in the field of glory, be kept out of sight. Wherever there is anything to be done, their providence is sure to direct my steps." These hopes and anticipations were soon to be fulfilled. Nelson's mind had long been irritated and depressed by the fear that a general action would take place before he could join the fleet. At length he sailed from Porto Ferrajo with a convoy for Gibraltar, and having reached that place, proceeded to the westward in search of the admiral. Off the mouth of the straits he fell in with the Spanish fleet, and on the 13th of February, reaching the station off Cape St. Vincent, communicated this intelligence to Sir John Jervis. He was now directed to shift his broad pendant on board the Captain, 74, Captain R.W. Miller, and before sunset the signal was made to prepare for action, and to keep, during the night, in close order. At daybreak the enemy were in sight. The British force consisted of 2 ships of 100 guns, 2 of 98, 2 of 90, 8 of 74, and 1 64, 15 of the line in all, with 4 frigates, a sloop, and a cutter. The Spaniards had 1 4-decker, of 136 guns, 6 3-deckers, of 112, 284, 1874 in all, 27 ships of the line, with 10 frigates and a brig. Their admiral, D. Joseph de Cordova, had learnt from an American on the 5th, that the English had only 9 ships, which was indeed the case when his informer had seen them, for a reinforcement of 5 ships from England, under Admiral Parker, had not then joined, and the Culloden had parted company. Upon this information the Spanish commander, instead of going into Cadiz, as was his intention when he sailed from Carthagena, determined to seek an enemy so inferior in force, and relying, with fatal confidence, upon the American account, he suffered his ships to remain too far dispersed, and in some disorder. When the morning of the 14th broke, and discovered the English fleet, a fog for some time concealed their number. That fleet had heard their signal guns during the night, the weather being fine though thick and hazy. Soon after daylight they were seen very much scattered, while the British ships were in a compact little body. The lookout ship of the Spaniards, fancying that her signal was disregarded because so little notice seemed to be taken of it, made another signal, that the English force consisted of 40 sail of the line. The captain afterwards said he did this to rouse the admiral. It had the effect of perplexing him and alarming the whole fleet. The absurdity of such an act shows what was the state of the Spanish navy under that miserable government by which Spain was so long oppressed and degraded, and finally betrayed. In reality, the general incapacity of the naval officers was so well known, that in a pasquinade, which about this time appeared at Madrid, wherein the different orders of the state were advertised for sale, the greater part of the sea officers, with all their equipments, were offered as a gift, and it was added, that any person who would please to take them, should receive a handsome gratuity. When the probability that Spain would take part in the war, as an ally of France, was first contemplated, Nelson said that their fleet, if it were no better than when it acted in alliance with us, would soon be done for. Before the enemy could form a regular order of battle, Sir J. Jarvis, by carrying a press of sail, came up with them, passed through their fleet, then tacked, and thus cut off 9 of their ships from the main body. These ships attempted to form on the larboard tack, either with a design of passing through the British line, or to leeward of it, and thus rejoining their friends. Only one of them succeeded in this attempt, and that only because she was so covered with smoke that her intention was not discovered till she had reached the rear. The others were so warmly received, that they put about, took to flight, and did not appear again in the action to its close. The admiral was now able to direct his attention to the enemy's main body, which was still superior in number to his whole fleet, and greatly so in weight of metal. He made signal to tack in succession. Nelson, whose station was in the rear of the British line, perceived that the Spaniards were bearing up before the wind, with an intention of forming their line, going large, and joining their separated ships, or else of getting off without an engagement. To prevent either of these schemes, he disobeyed the signal without a moment's hesitation, and ordered his ship to be wore. This at once brought him into action with the Santissima Trinidad, 136, the San Joseph, 112, the Salvador del Mundo, 112, the San Nicolas, 80, the San Isidro, 74, another 74, and another first-rate. Trubridge, in the Culloden, immediately joined, and most nobly supported him, and for nearly an hour did the Culloden and captain maintain what Nelson called this apparently, but not really unequal contest. Such was the advantage of skill and discipline, and the confidence which brave men derive from them. The Blenheim then passing between them and the enemy, gave them a respite, and poured in her fire upon the Spaniards. The Salvador del Mundo and San Isidro dropped astern, and were fired into in a masterly style by the excellent Captain Collingwood. The San Isidro struck, and Nelson thought that the Salvador struck also. But Collingwood, says he, disdaining the parade of taking possession of beaten enemies, most gallantly pushed up, with every sail set, to save his old friend and messmate, who was to appearance in a critical situation. For the captain was at this time actually fired upon by 3 first-rates by the San Nicolas, and by a 74, within about pistol-shot of that vessel. The Blenheim was ahead, the Culloden crippled and astern. Collingwood ranged up, and hauling up his mainsail just astern, passed within 10 feet of the San Nicolas, giving her a most tremendous fire, then passed on for the Santissima Trinidad. The San Nicolas luffing up, the San Joseph fell on board her, and Nelson resumed his station abreast of them, and close alongside. The captain was now incapable of further service, either in the line or in chase. She had lost her foretopmast, not a sail, shroud, or rope was left, and her wheel was shot away. Nelson therefore directed Captain Miller to put the helm a-starboard, and calling for the boarders, ordered them to board. Captain Berry, who had lately been Nelson's first lieutenant, was the first man who leaped into the enemy's mizzen chains. Miller, when in the very act of going, was ordered by Nelson to remain. Berry was supported from the spritsail-yard, which locked in the San Nicolas's main rigging. A soldier of the 69th broke the upper quarter-gallery window and jumped in, followed by the Commodore himself and by the others as fast as possible. The cabin doors were fastened, and the Spanish officers fired their pistols at them through the window. The doors were soon forced, and the Spanish brigadier fell while retreating to the quarterdeck. Nelson pushed on, and found Berry in possession of the poop, and the Spanish ensign hauling down. He passed on to the forecastle, where he met 2 or 3 Spanish officers, and received their swords. The English were now in full possession of every part of the ship, when a fire of pistols and musketry opened upon them from the Admiral's stern gallery of the San Joseph. Nelson, having placed sentinels at the different ladders, and ordered Captain Miller to send more men into the prize, gave orders for boarding that ship from the San Nicolas. It was done in an instant, he himself leading the way, and exclaiming, "Westminster Abbey or victory." Berry assisted him into the main chains, and at that moment a Spanish officer looked over the quarterdeck rail, and said they surrendered. It was not long before he was on the quarterdeck, where the Spanish captain presented to him his sword, and told him the Admiral was below dying of his wounds. There, on the quarterdeck of an enemy's first-rate, he received the swords of the officers, giving them, as they were delivered, one by one to William Ferny, one of his old age Eminenoens, who, with the utmost coolness, put them under his arm, bundling them up, in the lively expression of Collingwood, with as much composure as he would have made a faggot, though 22 sail of their line were still within gunshot. One of his sailors came up, and with an Englishman's feeling took him by the hand, saying he might not soon have such another place to do it in, and he was heartily glad to see him there. 24 of the captain's men were killed, and 56 wounded, a fourth part of the loss sustained by the whole squadron falling upon this ship. Nelson received only a few bruises. The Spaniards had still 18 or 19 ships which had suffered little or no injury. That part of the fleet which had been separated from the main body in the morning was now coming up, and Sir John Jarvis made signal to bring to. His ships could not have formed without abandoning those which they had captured, and running to leeward. The captain was lying a perfect wreck on board her 2 prizes, and many of the other vessels were so shattered in their masts and rigging as to be wholly unmanageable. The Spanish admiral meantime, according to his official account, being altogether undecided in his own opinion respecting the state of the fleet, inquired of his captains whether it was proper to renew the action. 9 of them answered explicitly that it was not. Others replied that it was expedient to delay the business. The Pelayo and the Prince Conquistador were the only ships that were for fighting. As soon as the action was discontinued, Nelson went on board the Admiral's ship. Sir John Jarvis received him on the quarterdeck, took him in his arms, and said he could not sufficiently thank him. For this victory the Commander-in-Chief was rewarded with the title of Earl St. Vincent. Nelson, who before the action was known in England had been advanced to the rank of Rear Admiral, had the Order of the Bath given him. The sword of the Spanish Rear Admiral, which Sir John Jarvis insisted upon his keeping, he presented to the Mayor and Corporation of Norwich, saying that he knew no place where it could give him or his family more pleasure to have it kept than in the capital city of the county where he was born. The freedom of that city was voted him on this occasion. But of all the numerous congratulations which he received, none could have affected him with deeper delight than that which came from his venerable father. "I thank my God," said this excellent man, "with all the power of a grateful soul, for the mercies he has most graciously bestowed on me in preserving you. Not only my few acquaintance here, but the people in general, met me at every corner with such handsome words, that I was obliged to retire from the public eye. The height of glory to which your professional judgment, united with a proper degree of bravery, guarded by Providence, has raised you, few sons, my dear child, attain to, and fewer fathers live to see. Tears of joy have involuntarily trickled down my furrowed cheeks. Who could stand the force of such general congratulation? The name and services of Nelson have sounded through this city of Bath from the common ballad singer to the public theatre. The good old man concluded by telling him that the field of glory, in which he had so long been conspicuous, was still open, and by giving him his blessing. Sir Horatio, who had now hoisted his flag as Rear Admiral of the Blue, was sent to bring away the troops from Porto Ferrajo. Having performed this, he shifted his flag to the Theseus. That ship had taken part in the mutiny in England, and being just arrived from home, some danger was apprehended from the temper of the men. This was one reason why Nelson was removed to her. He had not been on board many weeks before a paper, signed in the name of all the ship's company, was dropped on the quarterdeck, containing these words: "Success attend Admiral Nelson. God bless Captain Miller. We thank them for the officers they have placed over us. We are happy and comfortable, and will shed every drop of blood in our veins to support them, and the name of the Theseus shall be immortalized as high as her captain's." Wherever Nelson commanded, the men soon became attached to him. In 10 days' time he would have restored the most mutinous ship in the Navy to order. Whenever an officer fails to win the affections of those who are under his command, he may be assured that the fault is chiefly in himself. While Sir Horatio was in the Theseus, he was employed in the command of the inner squadron at the blockade of Cadiz. During this service, the most perilous action occurred in which he was ever engaged. Making a night attack upon the Spanish gunboats, his barge was attacked by an armed launch, under their commander, D. Miguel Tregoyan, carrying 26 men. Nelson had with him only his 10 bargemen, Captain Fremantle, and his coxswain, John Sykes, an old and faithful follower, who twice saved the life of his admiral by parrying the blows that were aimed at him, and at last actually interposed his own head to receive the blow of a Spanish sabre, which he could not by any other means avert. Thus dearly was Nelson beloved. This was a desperate service hand to hand with swords, and Nelson always considered that his personal courage was more conspicuous on this occasion than on any other during his whole life. Notwithstanding the great disproportion of numbers, 18 of the enemy were killed, all the rest wounded, and their launch taken. Nelson would have asked for a lieutenancy for Sykes, if he had served long enough. His manner and conduct, he observed, were so entirely above his situation, that nature certainly intended him for a gentleman. But though he recovered from the dangerous wound which he received in this act of heroic attachment, he did not live to profit by the gratitude and friendship of his commander. 12 days after this rencontre, Nelson sailed at the head of an expedition against Tenerife. A report had prevailed a few months before, that the Viceroy of Mexico, with the treasure ships, had put into that island. This had led Nelson to meditate the plan of an attack upon it, which he communicated to Earl St. Vincent. He was perfectly aware of the difficulties of the attempt. "I do not," said he, "reckon myself equal to Blake, but, if I recollect right, he was more obliged to the wind coming off the land than to any exertions of his own. The approach by sea to the anchoring place is under very high land, passing 3 valleys, therefore the wind is either in from the sea, or squally with calms from the mountains, and he perceived that if the Spanish ships were won, the object would still be frustrated if the wind did not come off shore. The land force, he thought, would render success certain, and there were the troops from Elba, with all necessary stores and artillery, already embarked. But here, said he, soldiers must be consulted, and I know, from experience, they have not the same boldness in undertaking a political measure that we have. We look to the benefit of our country, and risk our own fame every day to serve her. A soldier obeys his orders, and no more. Nelson's experience at Corsica justified him in this harsh opinion. He did not live to see the glorious days of the British Army under Wellington. The army from Elba, consisting of 3,700 men, would do the business, he said, in 3 days, probably in much less time, and he would undertake, with a very small squadron, to perform the naval part, for though the shore was not easy of access, the transports might run in and land the troops in 1 day. The report concerning the Viceroy was unfounded, but a homeward-bound Manila ship put into Santa Cruz at this time, and the expedition was determined upon. It was not fitted out upon the scale which Nelson had proposed. 4 ships of the line, 3 frigates, and the Fox cutter, formed the squadron, and he was allowed to choose such ships and officers as he thought proper. No troops were embarked, the seamen and marines of the squadron being thought sufficient. His orders were, to make a vigorous attack, but on no account to land in person, unless his presence should be absolutely necessary. The plan was, that the boats should land in the night, between the fort on the NE side of Santa Cruz Bay and the town, make themselves masters of that fort, and then send a summons to the governor. By midnight, the 3 frigates, having the force on board which was intended for this debarkation, approached within 3 miles of the place, but owing to a strong gale of wind in the offing, and a strong current against them inshore, they were not able to get within a mile of the landing place before daybreak, and then they were seen, and their intention discovered. Trubridge and Bowen, with Captain Oldfield, of the Marines, went upon this to consult with the Admiral what was to be done, and it was resolved that they should attempt to get possession of the heights above the fort. The frigates accordingly landed their men, and Nelson stood in with the line of battle ships, meaning to batter the fort for the purpose of distracting the attention of the garrison. A calm and contrary current hindered him from getting within a league of the shore, and the heights were by this time so secured, and manned with such a force, as to be judged impracticable. Thus foiled in his plans by circumstances of wind and tide, he still considered it a point of honor that some attempt should be made. This was on the 22nd of July, he re-embarked his men that night, got the ships on the 24th to anchor about 2 miles north of the town, and made show as if he intended to attack the heights. At 6 in the evening signal was made for the boats to prepare to proceed on the service as previously ordered. When this was done, Nelson addressed a letter to the Commander-in-Chief, the last which was ever written with his right hand. "I shall not," said he, "enter on the subject, why we are not in possession of Santa Cruz. Your partiality will give credit, that all has hitherto been done which was possible, but without effect. This night I, humble as I am, command the whole destined to land under the batteries of the town, and tomorrow my head will probably be crowned either with laurel or cypress. I have only to recommend Josiah Nisbet to you and my country. The Duke of Clarence, should I fall, will, I am confident, take a lively interest for my son-in-law, on his name being mentioned." Perfectly aware how desperate a service this was likely to prove, before he left the Theseus he called Lieutenant Nisbet, who had the watch on deck, into the cabin, that he might assist in arranging and burning his mother's letters. Perceiving that the young man was armed, he earnestly begged him to remain behind. "Should we both fall, Josiah," said he, "what will become of your poor mother? The care of the Theseus falls to you. Stay, therefore, and take charge of her." Nisbet replied, "Sir, the ship must take care of herself. I will go with you tonight, if I never go again." He met his captains at supper on board the Seahorse, Captain Fremantle, whose wife, whom he had lately married in the Mediterranean, presided at table. At 11 o'clock the boats, containing between 600 and 700 men, with 180 on board the Fox cutter, and from 70 to 80 in a boat which had been taken the day before, proceeded in 6 divisions toward the town, conducted by all the captains of the squadron, except Fremantle and Bowen, who attended with Nelson to regulate and lead the way to the attack. They were to land on the mole, and thence hasten as fast as possible into the great square, then form and proceed as should be found expedient. They were not discovered till about 1:30 o'clock, when, being within half gunshot of the landing place, Nelson directed the boats to cast off from each other, give a huzzah, and push for the shore. But the Spaniards were exceedingly well prepared, the alarm bells answered the huzzah, and a fire of 30 or 40 pieces of cannon, with musketry from one end of the town to the other, opened upon the invaders. Nothing, however, could check the intrepidity with which they advanced. The night was exceedingly dark. Most of the boats missed the mole and went on shore through a raging surf, which stove all to the left of it. The Admiral, Fremantle, Thompson, Bowen, and 4 or 5 other boats, found the mole. They stormed it instantly, and carried it, though it was defended, as they imagined, by 400 or 500 men. Its guns, which were 26-20-pounders, were spiked, but such a heavy fire of musketry and grape was kept up from the citadel and the houses at the head of the mole, that the assailants could not advance, and nearly all of them were killed or wounded. In the act of stepping out of the boat, Nelson received a shot through the right elbow, and fell, but as he fell he caught the sword, which he had just drawn, in his left hand, determined never to part with it while he lived, for it had belonged to his uncle, Captain Suckling, and he valued it like a relic. Nisbet, who was close to him, placed him at the bottom of the boat, and laid his hat over the shattered arm, lest the sight of the blood, which gushed out in great abundance, should increase his faintness. He then examined the wound, and taking some silk handkerchiefs from his neck, bound them round tight above the lacerated vessels. Had it not been for this presence of mind in his son-in-law, Nelson must have perished. One of his bargemen, by name Level, tore his shirt into shreds, and made a sling with them for the broken limb. They then collected 5 other seamen, by whose assistance they succeeded at length in getting the boat afloat, for it had grounded with the falling tide. Nisbet took one of the oars and ordered the steersman to go close under the guns of the battery, that they might be safe from its tremendous fire. Hearing his voice, Nelson roused himself, and desired to be lifted up in the boat that he might look about him. Nisbet raised him up, but nothing could be seen except the firing of the guns on shore, and what could be discerned by their flashes upon a stormy sea. In a few minutes a general shriek was heard from the crew of the Fox, which had received a shot under water, and went down. 97 men were lost in her, 83 were saved, many by Nelson himself, whose exertions on this occasion greatly increased the pain and danger of his wound. The first ship which the boat could reach happened to be the Seahorse, but nothing could induce him to go on board, though he was assured that if they attempted to row to another ship it might be at the risk of his life. "I had rather suffer death," he replied, "than alarm Mrs. Fremantle, by letting her see me in this state, when I can give her no tidings whatever of her husband." They pushed on for the Theseus. When they came alongside he peremptorily refused all assistance in getting on board, so impatient was he that the boat should return, in hopes that it might save a few more from the Fox. He desired to have only a single rope thrown over the side, which he twisted round his left hand, saying, "Let me alone, I have yet my legs left and one arm. Tell the surgeon to make haste and get his instruments. I know I must lose my right arm, so the sooner it is off the better." The spirit which he displayed in jumping up the ship's side astonished everybody. Fremantle had been severely wounded in the right arm soon after the Admiral. He was fortunate enough to find a boat on the beach, and got instantly to his ship. Thompson was wounded, Bowen killed, to the great regret of Nelson, as was also one of his own officers, Lieutenant Weatherhead, who had followed him from the Agamemnon, and whom he greatly and deservedly esteemed. Trubridge, meantime, fortunately for his party, missed the mole in the darkness, but pushed on shore under the batteries, close to the south end of the citadel. Captain Waller, of the Emerald, and 2 or 3 other boats, landed at the same time. The surf was so high that many others put back. The boats were instantly filled with water and stove against the rocks, and most of the ammunition in the men's pouches was wetted. Having collected a few men they pushed on to the great square, hoping there to find the Admiral and the rest of the force. The ladders were all lost, so that they could make no immediate attempt on the citadel, but they sent a sergeant with 2 of the townspeople to summon it. This messenger never returned, and Trubridge, having waited about an hour in painful expectation of his friends, marched to join Captains Hood and Miller, who had effected their landing to the southwest. They then endeavored to procure some intelligence of the Admiral and the rest of the officers, but without success. By daybreak they had gathered together about 80 marines, 80 pikemen, and 180 small-arm seamen, all the survivors of those who had made good their landing. They obtained some ammunition from the prisoners whom they had taken, and marched on to try what could be done at the citadel without ladders. They found all the streets commanded by field pieces, and several thousand Spaniards, with about 100 French, under arms, approaching by every avenue. Finding himself without provisions, the powder wet, and no possibility of obtaining either stores or reinforcements from the ships, the boats being lost, Trowbridge, with great presence of mind, sent Captain Samuel Hood with a flag of truce to the governor to say he was prepared to burn the town, and would instantly set fire to it if the Spaniards approached 1 inch nearer. This, however, if he were compelled to do it, he should do with regret, for he had no wish to injure the inhabitants, and he was ready to treat upon these terms that the British troops should reembark, with all their arms of every kind, and take their own boats, if they were saved, or be provided with such others as might be wanting, they, on their part, engaging that the squadron should not molest the town, or any of the Canary Islands, all prisoners on both sides to be given up. When these terms were proposed, the governor made answer, that the English ought to surrender as prisoners of war, but Captain Hood replied, he was instructed to say, that if the terms were not accepted in 5 minutes, Captain Trowbridge would set the town on fire and attack the Spaniards at the point of the bayonet. Satisfied with his success, which was indeed sufficiently complete, and respecting, like a brave and honourable man, the gallantry of his enemy, the Spaniard acceded to the proposal, found boats to re-embark them, their own having all been dashed to pieces in landing, and before they parted gave every man a loaf and a pint of wine. And here, says Nelson in his journal, it is right we should notice the noble and generous conduct of Don Juan Antonio Gutierrez, the Spanish governor. The moment the terms were agreed to, he directed our wounded men to be received into the hospitals, and all our people to be supplied with the best provisions that could be procured, and made it known that the ships were at liberty to send on shore and purchase whatever refreshments they were in want of during the time they might be off the island. A youth, by name Don Bernardo Callaghan, stripped himself of his shirt to make bandages for one of those Englishmen against whom, not an hour before, he had been engaged in battle. Nelson wrote to thank the governor for the humanity which he had displayed. Presents were interchanged between them. Sir Horatio offered to take charge of his despatches for the Spanish government, and thus actually became the first messenger to Spain of his own defeat. The total loss of the English in killed, wounded, and drowned amounted to 250. Nelson made no mention of his own wound in his official despatches, but in a private letter to Lord St. Vincent I which he wrote with his left hand, he shows himself to have been deeply affected by the failure of this enterprise. "I am become," he said, "a burthen to my friends, and useless to my country, but by my last letter you will perceive my anxiety for the promotion of my son-in-law, Josiah Nisbet. When I leave your command I become dead to the world, I go hence, and am no more seen. If from poor Bowen's loss, you think it proper to oblige me, I rest confident you will do it. The boy is under obligations to me, but he repaid me by bringing me from the mole of Santa Cruz. I hope you will be able to give me a frigate to convey the remains of my carcass to England. A left-handed admiral," he said in a subsequent letter, "will never again be considered as useful, therefore the sooner I get to a very humble cottage the better, and make room for a sounder man to serve the state." His first letter to Lady Nelson was written under the same opinion, but in a more cheerful strain. "It was the chance of war," said he, "and I have great reason to be thankful, and I know it will add much to your pleasure to find that Josiah, under God's providence, was principally instrumental in saving my life. I shall not be surprised if I am neglected and forgotten. Probably I shall no longer be considered as useful, however, I shall feel rich if I continue to enjoy your affection. I beg neither you nor my father will think much of this mishap. My mind has long been made up to such an event." His son-in-law, according to his wish, was immediately promoted, and honours enough to heal his wounded spirit awaited him in England. Letters were addressed to him by the First Lord of the Admiralty, and by his steady friend the Duke of Clarence, to congratulate him on his return, covered as he was with glory. He assured the Duke, in his reply, that not a scrap of that ardour with which he had hitherto served his king had been shot away. The freedom of the cities of Bristol and London were transmitted to him, he was invested with the Order of the Bath, and received a pension of L1000 a year. The memorial which, as a matter of form, he was called upon to present on this occasion, exhibited an extraordinary catalogue of services performed during the war. It stated that he had been in 4 actions with the fleets of the enemy, and in 3 actions with boats employed in cutting out of harbour, in destroying vessels, and in taking 3 towns. He had served on shore with the army 4 months, and commanded the batteries at the sieges of Basti and Calvi. He had assisted at the capture of 7 sail of the line, 6 frigates, 4 corvettes, and 11 privateers, taken and destroyed near 50 sail of merchant vessels, and actually been engaged against the enemy upwards of 120 times, in which service he had lost his right eye and right arm, and been severely wounded and bruised in his body. His sufferings from the lost limb were long and painful. A nerve had been taken up in one of the ligatures at the time of the operation, and the ligature, according to the practice of the French surgeons, was of silk instead of waxed thread. This produced a constant irritation and discharge, and the ends of the ligature being pulled every day, in hopes of bringing it away, occasioned fresh agony. He had scarcely any intermission of pain, day or night, for 3 months after his return to England. Lady Nelson, at his earnest request, attended the dressing of his arm, till she had acquired sufficient resolution and skill to dress it herself. One night, during this state of suffering, after a day of constant pain, Nelson retired early to bed, in hope of enjoying some respite by means of laudanum. He was at that time lodging in Bond Street, and the family were soon disturbed by a mob knocking loudly and violently at the door. The news of Duncan's victory had been made public, and the house was not illuminated. But when the mob were told that Admiral Nelson lay there in bed, badly wounded, the foremost of them made answer, "You shall hear no more from us tonight," and in fact, the feeling of respect and sympathy was communicated from one to another with such effect that, under the confusion of such a night, the house was not molested again. About the end of November, after a night of sound sleep, he found the arm nearly free from pain. The surgeon was immediately sent for to examine it, and the ligature came away with the slightest touch. From that time it began to heal. As soon as he thought his health established, he sent the following form of thanksgiving to the minister of St. George's, Hanover Square. An officer desires to return thanks to Almighty God for his perfect recovery from a severe wound, and also for the many mercies bestowed on him. Not having been in England till now, since he lost his eye, he went to receive a year's pay as smart money, but could not obtain payment, because he had neglected to bring a certificate from a surgeon that the sight was actually destroyed. A little irritated that this form should be insisted upon, because, though the fact was not apparent, he thought it was sufficiently notorious, he procured a certificate at the same time for the loss of his arm, saying, they might just as well doubt one as the other. This put him in good humour with himself, and with the clerk who had offended him. On his return to the office, the clerk, finding it was only the annual pay of a captain, observed, he thought it had been more. "Oh," replied Nelson, "this is only for an eye. In a few days I shall come for an arm, and in a little time longer, God knows, most probably for a leg." Accordingly he soon afterwards went, and with perfect good humour exhibited the certificate of the loss of his arm. That was the Life of Horatio, Lord Nelson by Robert Southey. Part 4. 1796 to 1797. Which was read for you by Long Stories for Sleep. Thank you very much for listening. Good night.